What's up, nerds, and welcome back to the Help My Nerds podcast. Today, we're talking about Dungeons and Dragons and what it is before you ever sit down at the table for your first game. So, without further ado, let's get into it. So, what is Dungeons and Dragons? Dungeons and Dragons is a tabletop role-playing game that can be played in person at an actual table with people, or online through services like Discord, Roll20, Boundary, and so many others that the list would be exponentially long. I'm just not going to get into them, but those are the top three that I can remember off the top of my head, and I think the most popular ways to do it as well. You can also use D&D Beyond for character sheets, and they do have their own digital map gaming software, but to me, it's lackluster. Let me know in the comments if you agree with that. I still think that Roll20 and Foundry are superior to their map-making software on D&D Beyond. That is just my personal opinion. You may have a different one. But before we get sidetracked with that, let's actually look at what D&D is. So, you may have heard of D&D or through general pop culture osmosis, through shows like Big Bang Theory, Community, Stranger Things is the biggest one. You may have even seen clips on TikTok through of Dimension 20 or the big one, Critical Role. You may have also seen like others playing D&D at your local game store when you've gone in to buy comics or get cards for various card games that you're playing. There are also connections to Magic the Gathering, as they're owned by the same parent company, so you may have heard of it through their crossover there. So there are many ways that you may have heard of D&D, but not actually dived into it. The Magic the Gathering is the way that I learned about D&D and got me into D&D because of the crossover with one of the sets that came out around the time I was getting into Magic. So that's what actually got me into Dungeons and Dragons. And from there, I was able to get my sister and brother-in-law into D&D, my cousin into D&D, my partner into D&D. And we now run a local game for a charity every other Monday, which is really fun. And we play with family every Sunday when we can. So that is why I really do love D&D, and I think it brings a lot of people together. We do also have on the channel us playing D&D as the Nerds of the Round Table. Yeah, it is 5th edition for those that are wondering, because D&D is split into many editions. The current one is 5e or 5.5e. It was called 1 D&D at one point, 5.5, but it has been subsequently changed to 5.5e, so that there aren't any confusion, I will be referring to it as 5.5 from this point onwards. But yeah, with that being said, what on earth is it? And let's actually describe what D&D is. So D&D is a collaborative storytelling game where you and some friends, usually 4 to 5 friends, sit down and play the game and tell a story. Usually one of you will be the arbiter of the rules and the storyteller, the main storyteller, known as a dungeon master or game master in some circles. This person will lay out the broad strokes of the plot. Think of them as the individual that supplies the canvas or the clay, and the rest of everybody as those that are helping to sculpt or paint the painting. That is the way that I think of it. Or a writer's room where you have a head writer, which would be the dungeon master, and then everybody else is joining in to help write the show and pitching ideas and everything like that. So it becomes a collaborative thing, because the dungeon master has basic plot points that you stick to keep the campaign going, and so that things can actually flow. That's why I think of them as like the head writer or the producer, more more akin to a producer than a head writer, I suppose. And then the writing team is the rest of the table, as they all congregate to create the story together, as long as it like hits those point beats, which can be used for leveling up later in the game. When we get to that, I'll explain what I mean, but there are two forms of leveling up that can be used in Dungeons and Dragons, and I tend to use this version as it helps establish where plot points should actually be, at least for me. So that's the way that I see it. It's like you can do whatever the players can do whatever they want, but then but the dungeon master just keeps things a little bit more streamlined for the story. So it's a sandbox, but the sandbox has a rim around it so that you're not just in a desert. That's that's how I see it. Let me know if you have a different view on how D&D should be run. I do like to hear other takes on it. I also like it as to look at it like an RPG video game where you can basically go off and do whatever you want in side quests, but occasionally you will go back to the main story. And when you go back to the main story, there might be cutscenes and you can't avoid the cutscenes. Yeah, okay, once you've gone through the playthrough, there might be a skip button, but in some of the older games, there weren't until you'd completed the game. It's kind of like that. Those cutscenes, the main story intruding on your wide explorer moment. That's the way I see the dungeon master's role in this collaborative thing. Just a way to keep the story flowing so that there is a narrative to it. They are the narrative current, and the rest of the story is provided by the players. And I know I'm rabbiting on. It's just there's a lot of nuance to this point, and a lot of people get confused by this point. So I'm trying to articulate it in a way that people can understand what I mean by it. So I'm trying to use as many analogies as possible to explain this point, because a lot of people think that the dungeon master just writes the whole story and then people sit down at the table and play the story, and there's not really much agency to it. That's not supposed to be the case. I'm not going to say that there aren't horror stories where that is the case, but that's not supposed to be the case. What's supposed to be the case, as I said, is that the Dungeon Master is supposed to come with broad strokes of what the narrative current is supposed to be, which should have been agreed on in a session 0, a session before the game begins. And then everybody sits down and they fill in the blanks together by making their own choices. And that's what does it. Now, you'll be thinking, okay, that's interesting, but where do the dice come in? Now, the dice comes in because of chance. Everything in Dungeons and Dragons has a chance to it. Sometimes the dungeon master will put something in front of you and you will say something that you want to do and it will be impossible, and therefore the dice will not be used. But more than likely, there is a chance you can do whatever it is you want to do, and therefore the dice will come out. And that's what the dice are for. You have a presumed set of skills that you can use. You have a certain set of skills that you can use, and the dice are used with the modifiers of those skills to determine the success or failure of the action you are trying to take. So, for example, if you want to remember something from your past that you think would help with the current situation because you're in an ancient temple and according to your backstory, you studied history for 3 years at the University of the Great Dragon of Khan or whatever, then you would roll to see how much you remember, and you would add your history modifier to it to see how much of it you do remember. And with that, you if you got a high number, say the difficulty of you remembering it was 10 and you rolled 11, 13, and you had a plus from your history of 2, your result would be, which means you succeeded on remembering whatever it is you needed to remember. But if you rolled below that 10, and say you got a 4 and your plus was still 2, you got 6, so you would fail to remember what it is you were trying to remember. Does that, I'm hoping that that makes sense as to why you would bring the dice in for that. It's so that there is a chance you could remember this, but there isn't always it doesn't always work. So say there is a cliff that is 30 meters high, and on the opposite side, there is another cliff that's the same height, but it's 100 feet across. You couldn't then say, I'm going to try and jump that, because unless you had an insane stat, even rolling what is considered a nat 20 would make that impossible, which is why the DM would say, I don't even bother rolling, because there is no chance of you making that even with a critical success. And critical successes don't automatically guarantee that you will succeed in skill checks. That is usually for combat related things. So you might get a cool DM that allows critical successes and failures in skill checks, but it isn't supposed to guarantee critical success in skill checks and stuff like that. So just be wary of that when you do sit down at a table and you want to make an impossible jump, or you want to remember something you weren't even born for and you never attended school. Say you're a barbarian that's been wandering the woods for the last 30 years and you're only 30, and you say, oh, I want to remember this ancient civilization from 3,000 years ago. Well, while that might be something the wizard could possibly do because of their education, it's not something that you would probably be able to do because of your backstory. So it does go on that as well. Now, when it comes to combat, the dices vary for different reasons. You roll the d20 to see if you hit, and each weapon will have a modifier based on it to hit, and it's either your strength or dexterity, depending on the weapon, if it's a dex weapon or a strength-based weapon. So, and whether you're proficient with with the weapon. So, because sometimes you can be proficient with the weapon because of your class, and sometimes you can't. You might have found the weapon in a dungeon, picked it up, decided to use it, but you've never actually used the weapon before in your backstory or your history, and therefore you have no proficiency with it. So your bonus of proficiency would not be added to it, which means your plus to hit would be lower than with any other weapon that you're using of that type. I hope that I am articulating how the dice do play factors in this game well enough for you, and that you are kind of understanding the basics of like the dice. I'm not going into like the nitty gritty on everything. That would require a whole deep dive into the books and everything like that. If you do want something like that, then do let us know. But this is just a basic overview of Dungeons and Dragons. So that's all I'm trying to do. Just give you a basic rundown of like how it works. Now, as I mentioned, you do have your skills, but because of your skills, you have your base stats. So think RPG games and stuff like that, where you have your base stats. For D&D, that is strength, dexterity, constitution, wisdom, intelligence, and charisma. Strength is pretty straightforward. It's how strong you are. Your dexterity, again, pretty straightforward. It's how dexterous you are and how nimble and movable you are and sneaky. For your constitution, again, pretty straightforward. How hard you are to hit, how easy it is for you to get poisoned and all that stuff, how healthy you are, so that will determine your health points, plus how much you roll as well. Your dex also determines your initiative score. Your initiative score is what you roll at the beginning of combat to see where you go in turn order on combat. We'll get to that in a moment, though. Then you have your intelligence score. That just denotes how intelligent you are, how smart you are. Things like history and all that come from your intelligence. Then there is your wisdom score that just shows how wise you are, how good you are at perceiving things, and how good you are at being able to tell if someone is lying to you. It's also used for your religion, so it's good for if you are playing a cleric relies on that. And then there is your charisma score. This is how intimidating you are, how persuasive you are, and this is good for classes like paladins and warlocks, as paladins need to be like this face of the party, this holy figure. They don't need to be holy in the sense of they worship a god, but they do need to radiate like this oath that they take, which is like it's more devout than holy, I suppose. And then there's the cleric, there's the warlock, who kind of needs the charisma to be able to sway whichever entity they swayed into the bargain that they struck with them to be able to get their powers. Because for those of you that don't know what a warlock is a spellcaster that doesn't actually have any innate power and didn't learn it from a book, but they met a devil or an eldritch being or a fae, and they convinced them to lend them their strength, kind of like a sugar daddy. So they need that charisma to kind of explain that away. So I do like that their strongest stat is usually charisma. Now you can go against type. You can have a very strong, not very charismatic warlock. You can have impressed their patron with their sheer strength. You could have a very intelligent but not very wise cleric. You could have a very wise but not very dexterous ranger. You could have a very charismatic but not very strong barbarian. Like, it would be very fun to actually play against type, in my opinion. So I do think that that's a good thing that you can do there. Now, I do want to dispel one myth that I do see floating around sometimes, and that is that there is no winner in D&D. Yes, you can defeat the dragon at the end of the campaign, or save the girl, or village, or children, or guy, or kingdom, or prince, or whatever the quest goal was. You can accomplish the quest goal, but that doesn't mean you beat the game. There is no beating the game. There is just beating the said threat. There is no beating Dungeons and Dragons. There is beating the monster in front of you and collectively telling a story as a group. If you are sitting down at a table expecting to win the game and beat Dungeons and Dragons, then you're playing the wrong game. Dungeons and Dragons doesn't have a system to beat Dungeons and Dragons. It has a system to beat the monster in front of you, but on the next session, you'll be beating the next monster and the next monster. And even if you beat the BBEG, you can go on to play another campaign as the same character and beat the next BBEG, and so on and so on and so on. Some people have been playing the same character for over 30 years and played in countless campaigns as that character. So there is no beating Dungeons and Dragons. I know I've said that like 3 times at this point. I just want to reiterate it as much as I can. The DM has the final word according to the Player's Handbook and Dungeon Master's Guide. They are like the referee. They're supposed to be impartial. It can happen again in horror stories where they're not. So if there is a conflict between two players saying two different things about how things could work. The DM is supposed to be the law and lay it down and be like, right, this is how it's going to work, at least at this table. It can be different from table to table because they may have ruled on it differently. The DM also runs the monsters and keeps the story moving, while you are solely responsible for your character and exactly your character. That's it. You are not supposed to micromanage someone else's character, tell them what their character can do, or anything like that. It's your responsibility to run your character and remember what your character can do. That's your entire role as a D&D player. Now, if someone is asking for help, that's a different scenario. But in general, your responsibility is to be your character, which allows you to take on the role of a hero, talk to NPCs and villains, and unlike video games, there is no limit to your dialogue option. You can say what you want. Usually, some people may have put off certain terms or phrases, session zero, as it might make people uncomfortable for certain things to be said. That will be the only limitation put on speech. But within that confine, you can say what you want. As long as you feel like it fits your character, then you can say what you want. And as long as you're not making other people at the table feel uncomfortable. And if someone does say that they feel uncomfortable by the way you're acting, it's not really a rule within D&D, but it shouldn't have to be. It's just common courtesy to stop doing that. Like, if you are making someone uncomfortable by the way you are playing a specific character and they have voiced that to you and you still play that character the way that you are, despite that person telling you that they are uncomfortable and they have explained why they are uncomfortable, then you are just being a jerk at that point. So just be mindful. Again, it's a collective game, it's not your game. So you have to think about other people when you are saying things. Yes, there is no limitation on what you can do or say unless agreed upon at session zero. But think about whether you'd want to be spoken to like that, even in game, before you open your mouth to say something. That's just my piece of advice for you. So, as promised, we'll now talk about leveling and how that works. So, there are two ways that leveling can work within D&D. You can level up using the experience points leveling. You'll note this mainly from video games where you accumulate XP through killing monsters or social interactions and things like that. And when you reach a certain threshold of XP, you advanced to the next level. This is sort of how Baldur's Gate works, or many RPGs work, akin to Skyrim, Star Wars The Old Republic, and things like that. You accumulate experience points and then you level up using that system. I don't think I really need to go into how XP works. I think everyone is familiar with how XP leveling works. Then there is milestone leveling. This is what I sort of touched on earlier, which can be used to denote the flow of the game and where certain key plot points can be. This is when you reach a specific key point in the game, you just receive a level. So you need to defeat this mini boss and you defeat the mini boss, then you receive the level because that mini boss has been defeated. In my current game of D&D that I'm running for the charity that I spoke about earlier, they're running a dungeon to try and stop this evil boss from getting to the crystal that they're trying to defend first. When they reach the end of the dungeon, they will be receiving a level up because that's the milestone that they need to reach. Once they've completed that milestone, they will have reached sort of like the save point. And once they reach the save point, they'll receive their reward of a level up. That's how that works. So those are the two systems you can use for leveling up within D&D. Each have their own benefit and downside. For milestoning, it's a bit slower on the level uptake. So depending on how your DM spreads out each level up, whereas XP grinding can be quite quicker depending on how your party splits the XP amongst themselves and how your DM rules XP to work. So that's the benefit to XP against milestoning. Whereas milestoning can feel like you're actually progressing the story, and XP can just feel like a murder hobo grind and shoot kind of game. So that's the downside to XP and the upside to milestoning. It swings and roundabouts on which one you prefer. For me and the games that I run, I prefer milestoning. I feel like it just ebbs and flows the game a lot better, but your DM might prefer, and your playstyle might prefer this grind and kill to earn and farm style of gaming. So it's all down to your playstyle, really. There are other mechanics that we won't really dive into today, and if you do want us to dive into it in more detail, we can do another video on D&D, which would be the anatomy of the character sheet and how the classes work, how the species or races as they used to be called work, and how multiclassing work. I think that that's a bit more advanced than a basic overview, which is what we're trying to do here. So I will leave that for another video. So do let us know in the comments down below if that is something you would like us to dive into. But with that, I think I just want to leave you with a piece of advice if you are a new D&D player before we end this video, and that's you do not have to be a professional actor, voice actor, or Matt Mercer level creative to be able to play D&D. D&D is a game for everyone, every nerd that's ever wanted to swing a sword, wand, or battle axe, or just feel like they are part of the fellowship or the resistance or anything like that. It's literally just designed for anyone that wants to do an adventure and sling spells. If you want to run an isekai D&D, you run an isekai D&D. If you want to run JJK as a D&D game, you run JJK as a D&D game. I'm actually doing that for Nerd of the Roundtable Oakley as a birthday present. If you want to play Star Wars as a D&D, there are supplements to do that. If you want to play Treasure Planet, there is Spelljammer for that. So don't think that you have to be on the level of these massive, multi-talented creatives that you see online to be able to play D&D. The only barrier to entry for D&D is the rules, which you can find free online. And the thing is, once you sit down and find the rule set for D&D, whichever edition it is that has taken your fancy, if it's the edition you saw on Stranger Things, or if it's the more modern version, then you sit down, you find the rule set for free on sites like D&D Beyond. They have the basic rule set for free, easy to download as a PDF, or you can just find it by Googling D&D rules and you'll find the PDF available to play. And sit down, find a group to play with. I know that's easier said than done, but once you do find your nerdy little group or your friends, if you can convince them to play with you, get them together and play D&D, you will enjoy this if this is your type of thing. And yeah, just don't try and live up to those people and you will enjoy yourself. If you are holding yourself to their standard, that's where your enjoyment will fall off. For me, I feel like that's what a lot of people tend to do, and they end up ruining their own experience because they think they have to be Matt Mercer, Brandon Lee Mulligan, or anyone who is famous for being an outrageously good DM, and you don't. So please, new D&D players, don't try and be the cast of Critical Role or Dimension 20 or Dungeons and Daddies, and just be yourselves and enjoy the game. And remember, just treat everyone with respect. Have fun with your table. And with that being said, I'm going to call this video to an end. And as always, stay happy, stay healthy, and most of all, stay nerdy.